This is Thursday. I have lunch in about half an hour, so I'm going to get a quick bit of exercise in. And while I do that, I'm going to go over my notes for Beyond the Blue Horizon by Brian Fagan, which is a book I read, golly, 4 or 5 years ago. It is about ancient mariners and sort of the early history of seafaring for humans. I'll go ahead and share my screen so you can see my notes. And let's go ahead and get started. So this is the very first highlight. Traveling the Indian Ocean waters depended on the predictable reversals of the monsoon winds over a wide area between Southeast Asia and Africa. So when you look at the Swahili coast, Eastern Africa, and the Indian Ocean, trade there is very cyclical. The monsoon winds go in one direction for a couple of months, and then they turn around and they go in the other direction for a couple more months. It's very straightforward. This led very predictably to the first global maritime trade networks. It's still relevant today. Monsoon winds are responsible for some of the nastiest famines in world history. I'm actually, I think my article today that goes out today is about the Bengali famine. So this is a really important weather phenomenon for human trade, but almost no science fiction books that I read about, space. All of them tend to be these Napoleonic wars in space kind of deals. So David Weber's Honor Harrington books, they're very Napoleonic. Whenever you see somebody really getting deep into a metaphor about sailing in space, you tend to get Age of Sail stuff. But the monsoon winds are really interesting, and the way that it impacted society is also really interesting. And I'm interested to see if there are any books like that. Somebody should write one. If not, so that was this note here. Next, we have a piece about Southeast Asian mainlanders. Sorry, we're paddling or sailing from island to island 50,000 years ago, which is, if I remember my numbers correctly, sort of well before the rise of civilizations. People have been trading across the oceans, in the seas, in open water for many, many, many thousands of years. And we think about globalization in sort of the internet information age, but we have trade networks that show obsidian and other tools just traveling insane amounts of distance. Sailors in the ancient world were really amazing. And in a lot of ways, I think that the human impulse to go beyond the shore and go out, even if it's just a little bit, trade to one spot and then somebody else goes and somebody else goes. But we have really managed to crisscross the world. And it's not surprising to me that so many people are interested in fiction and in sort of reality with the drive for the moon and Mars. It's not surprising to me that now that we have good satellite imagery of basically the whole world and those frontiers are lost, and it's really hard to get beyond the horizon in a meaningful way. It's not surprising to me that we've, as a species, sort of turned our attention to space. So this is about the nature of sailors. So this is about Tom, who I think that Brian was out sailing with. He had a compass, a pair of binoculars, a pole, and he was doing depth finding. And he's very patient, and that is a characteristic that I have found of sailors and seamen and watermen. And my family is from that just Chesapeake Bay region, and my uncle is quite the fisherman. He has a big charter boat. He really enjoys fishing, and he's not a patient man with people, but you go out and you wait for the right day to go. You keep an eye on the weather. You can't make plans when to go fish very far in advance, because you don't know if there's going to be a storm. You don't know if you don't know if the winds are going to be right. You take the day as it comes and you go with it. So that's, you have your tools and then you have your patience, and that's I think really fundamental to the nature of sailing in the ancient world and today. particularly sailing and not motorboats. I'm not much of a sailor, but I have friends who are, and you really are at the mercy of the winds. Sorry. So this is the same guy, Tom. Heavy grease, packed it into a cavity in the bottom of the lead weight. So they're sounding for depth, it looks like, and they're looking to find their way inshore safely. And I think I saved this mostly because it was a nice look at the mechanics of depth finding and sounding, which I never knew about before. Um, this next section is about the advantages of open water, which you don't hear about very often. But when there's a storm, you you don't you don't stay in shallow water. You either find a really safe harbor or you go way out into the ocean, which tends to be safer. Not always. If you are caught in a really nasty typhoon, like my dad was once, if the winds alone can break your mast, and sort of leave you leave you in a really rough spot. But in places where the winds are relatively predictable, you don't get pop-up squalls the way that you do in the West Atlantic. There are advantages to be out in the open sea. You don't have the rocks to get knocked up against. You don't have to worry about running aground, which I have definitely done. There's just fewer things to worry about out in the open ocean. But you still have to worry about the wind. So this is about other threats that you can face out in the open ocean. So you have fog, you have unmarked rocks, especially close to shore. But if the winds are against you, you are kind of boned. You are stuck. And then even today we have piracy. When I was teaching, my students were always very surprised to discover that like Somali pirates are a thing, and that pirates are real, and that pirates are widely considered the bad guys. They are like actually thieves. And not that thieves aren't also a mainstay of children's stories. There's always the Robin Hoods of the world, but it's sort of like slavery. But kids find it very startling to discover that pirates and slaves are real in the real world in the modern day. Mostly the United States military and Navy kind of tries to suppress them, but it's not perfect. And the Somali coast in particular is a really rough area with with like the Red Sea and the passages and the canals. Like some of them are just not safe even today, and it's a real shame that things are impacting trade the way that they are. Even today, there are whole sections of trade routes that are just not safe, and shipping will go around. Okay, so this is just talking about, we don't know why the first long distance explorations happened, in the same way that we don't really know what made the first person to get on the back of a horse actually do it. Like, was it a dare? Was it an accident? Nobody really knows. Nobody's ever going to know, but it's nice to think about. Okay, so this is something I have a question about, and I should actually flag this. I'm gonna make a tag to follow this up. I don't know if sharks are like a real thing that sailors were actually afraid of, or if this is just one of those things that sort of becomes myth, and is a modern thing where, like, these days you go swimming at the beach and you freak out when you see a shark and you're afraid it's going to eat you. But I don't know if fear of man-eating sharks is something that the ancient world had. I don't know if most people knew how to swim recreationally the way that we do. I know that bathing in rivers was a thing, but I don't know about like ocean beaches, and I'm curious. I'd like to know more. So I'll look that up later on. Maybe I'll write an article about it. Here, there we go. All right, article seed. Okay, so knowledge of islands visible at a distance starts on land, where conditions are good enough to make out neighboring islands. But at sea, you can see very far out, but even when there's good visibility, it's just hard to see land. So you don't think about it, but you're higher up when you're looking from land out to land, and that really does have an impact on how much you can see. A voyaging corridor, which enjoyed favorable weather conditions and, most important, predictable and relatively gentle winds that allowed people to sail out to islands visible on the horizon and also to return as the seasons changed without having to battle headwinds. So this is similar to the monsoon winds. It might even be the same region, but the idea is in some parts of the world, not in my part of the world, but in some parts of the world, it is actually quite simple to travel in the spring or the fall to one island, and then when 6 months later, when the weather changes again, or 3 months later, depending on the area, you just go back home according to the winds. Like sailing in some places of the world is very predictable. Poles must soon have become flat-bladed paddles. So this is talking about the evolution of sailing tools, and talking about how some people in some regions, it makes more sense to do poling. Like you see this in marshes a lot, where you get down and you dig your pole into the ground and then you kind of pull the boat along. And then in other places you have paddles where you push water, kind of like more like this. And oars are a different motion entirely. You see that a lot in the Aegean Sea, actually, with sort of the Greek galleys, where they're rowing very fast. And then this is talking about how rafts are just they're great for moving lots of things, and they're relatively stable in calm weather, but you can't really control them the way that you can control something with a keel and a pointed nose. But they really can get quite big. So if you're trying to build something with a keel that is made out of lots of pieces of wood, it's a lot more difficult, right? Like you can't just rope them together and hope they keep their form. The way, like a raft, you can make it pretty flat. Like flat is easier than a nice, like even keel. And for the same amount of for the same amount of lumber, you can have a much more, like you have more people you can hold that way. So, all right, reeds make for light boats, easily carried ashore, but they become waterlogged and useless within 2 or 3 days. So this is mostly just talking about the downsides of rafts and how they're not like a permanent thing. But dugouts are canoes. Dugout canoes have crossed rivers and lakes since very early times, and work pretty straightforwardly. So a dugout canoe is you take a tree trunk and you dig out kind of the middle of the tree trunk, and you're limited to the size of the tree trunk. So they're long, they're narrow, they're not as stable as a raft. It's very easy to tip. I don't like kayaks, kind of for this reason. Like a canoe, you can fit more than one person on. I find that they're more above the water. They don't freak me out as much, but a kayak, they're kind of designed to even if you flip, you tip back up. But I don't like having my legs immobilized like that. It terrifies me, sort of the way that dugout canoes terrify Brian Fagan. Although I've only ever used sort of like aluminum canoes. I've never tried a wooden one. Dugouts in their most basic form paled in comparison with the raft, even if they moved faster when paddled in calm water, mostly because of the carrying capacity, and just they're smaller, so they're harder to maneuver, and they're not as sturdy. So they're not as stable either. They're tippy. You can do something like an outrigger. So if you've ever seen Waterworld, there's like a pontoon boat not a pontoon. There's like 2 long floaty things and then kind of a net in the middle very often. And then that makes it more stable. You have kind of 2 canoes next to each other, and then you can put a sail in the middle, and they're pretty fun. I actually, when I was in Curacao, we went out on a boat in this similar configuration. Obviously, it had a motor and was not made out of wood, but that configuration is still very stable and still used today. This is one of Brian Fagan's personal anecdotes. He's talking about a young man standing at the bow of each canoe, watching for the telltale color changes in the water. So they're looking for land. And then they find land, and then they find somewhere to go ashore, and they start looking around. So I think I saved this mostly just as a nice explanation and visual of like how that would look if I were writing a story in this kind of setting. So fish, yeah. So I've experienced this too in the Chesapeake Bay. You can often find really good fishing spots right next to a drop off. Um, so like you kind of want to hug, not sure, but you want to hug the ledge. There's like an underwater ledge where it'll go underwater, like where they dredge a channel. So you like to be right near the edge of the channel where it'll drop off from like 20 feet to 50 feet to let the big boats through. Fish really like to hang out there because they like the shadows to help them hide. You'll also find something really similar where there's often fish hanging out underneath of a pier or near the like channel marker buoys. So like the fish like to hide, and I don't know if this is because they're hiding from birds or if they're hiding from fish that like to hang out in deeper water or what. But it is definitely true that if you have a boat, fish will start sort of like coming up underneath of it, which is sort of counterproductive from their perspective because there's often people, but so it goes. All right, so the natural dynamics of fishing and coastal living were never static. People were always on the move, families splintered, relatives quarreled. Disputes over fishing territories or food shortages threatened survival. And just as on land, the option of moving away was always there. So I've come across this idea before that the ancient world was much more fluid than the modern world. Obviously, like you can move to Spain or I don't know, Portugal or Argentina or whatever, but it's harder than it used to be. It used to be you just sort of like, oh, I'm annoyed at my neighbor. I'm gonna just move. And you would kind of get up and you would take your stuff and you would just kind of go. And there would be somewhere to go. Heinlein talks about this in some of his books about the frontier spirit and how like there's something to be said for pushing for having the frontiers that people can push in order to kind of keep society stable. Like the people who are unhappy can leave instead of having to fight about it. And you see that a lot in a lot of different parts of the world, particularly places with nomads and people who travel a lot, like sailors. I wonder if there's kind of a selection effect there. Certainly, the books I've read that talk about how people who live in space are just kind of built different than people who live on planets. So it's an interesting thing. So this is talking about how the explorers didn't necessarily have agriculture, like they weren't planting farms or anything, but there's things for them to hunt, and in some places, you know, even thousands and thousands of years ago, humans are really good at finding food, and we're very good at hunting, and in particular, we sometimes end up overhunting. And this has happened. Like, this isn't new. This is like we are probably as a species responsible for the extinction of lots and lots of megafauna. Like really big stuff that's good to hunt. Like we eat. It's not new that we drive species to extinction with our appetites and our success. So we often end up shifting food resources. We import things to hunt. You see this in Australia, much to Australia's sort of dismay, New Guinea. And like eventually you can plant crops and you can seed things, and even if you don't maintain them, then when you come back, there's something for you to eat. So we are quite good at making sure that there is food for us to eat, even if we are the reason that there was no food for us to eat. So this is talking about a canoe sailing in waves is far more stable if it becomes a platform than a single hull. So this is the same thing about outriggers. But this is talking about how outriggers are great, but the old style ones, like the dugouts that were handmade out of wood, we don't have any of them anymore. We know about them from pictures, we know about them from stories, but we don't actually have any physical canoes remaining. And this is talking about coral reefs, coastal surface revealed only by rapidly changing colors in the water. So this is talking about why it's always somebody's job to keep an eye out for reefs and things that you could run aground on. It's really important that somebody be available to watch for danger. And it's actually it's a surprisingly difficult thing to do because you have a lot of responsibility, but it's very boring. I find this in my own work. So I do quality assurance for Readwise Reader, which is the app that I'm sort of reviewing here. And I'm working, but part of it is just that you do the same monotonous thing, and sometimes the changes can creep up on you. So you're looking out at sea, and you're looking out at sea, and you're looking out at sea, and you're supposed to be keeping an eye out for, blue water. But if it's not a sharp change, if it just gradually gets more and more teal, then it can slip by you because you're just you accept it even when you're supposed to be looking. Sometimes bugs slip through where I don't even notice a small visual change that does. Like, I notice things like, oh hey, I took a highlight, the app crashed. Like those are easy to prevent from getting out, but computers in some ways are much better at flagging these small subtle shifts in color because they don't get bored. The human brain is very, very good at filtering out noise. So you look for sudden changes, but those small gradual changes are just really tough to catch. This one is talking about myths and how storytelling becomes landmarks. So, as you can see in my note, my uncle used to do this. There was this rocket. He would tell a story about this rocket, and it was a completely made up pile of nonsense story. But there was a lighthouse that we used as a landmark sailing back across the Chesapeake Bay. So I lived on the sort of the west coast of the Chesapeake Bay, and we often fished underneath the bridge. So we would take his boat and we would go out, and then he would teach me how to drive home and how to do it safely with all the mile markers and everything. And the rocket is just a lighthouse that's like red and it goes straight up, and he would call it the rocket, and he'd tell me all these stories, and I'm never going to forget how to get home from the Chesapeake Bay Bridge, because stories are how people remember. And there's something similar with the memory palace. It's obviously not stories, but there's like a way to remember that is tied to your perception of location. So if you in your head, you picture your house, and then you imagine that there's a statue of George Washington in the foyer, you may find it easier to remember that George Washington was the first president. And then some people do spatial reasoning that way. I personally find it easier to remember the story. So I can't remember George Washington, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson very easily. I have to think about it. Like, I can't just rattle off a list. I'm not very good at that kind of memorization. But I can certainly remember that Jefferson almost fell afoul of Adams' Alien and Sedition Act, and that we had all of these rules about how you weren't allowed to criticize the president, which, like, Adams would be appalled by the current political situation. But the Alien and Sedition Act was considering it sedition to criticize him, and Jefferson running against Adams for president was practically considered treason. And I remember that story because it blew my mind the first time I heard it. What do you mean? I thought that the whole transfer of power thing was like a feature of democracy, but that wasn't how the founders envisioned it. At least not Adams. Adams thought that it was going to be like, okay, Washington appointed me his heir. I'm going to serve my 2 terms, and I'm going to find my heir, and it's all going to be like very settled. Like, the idea of these elections being acrimonious was, I think, not something that Adams was prepared for. I'm kind of talking about my butt here. I might have long since forgotten details. But the point is, I can remember Washington, Adams, Jefferson, and then Madison, because of Marbury versus Madison is what set up the nature of the relationship between the Supreme Court and the executive branch. And then after that was the Monroe Doctrine. And I remember it in that order because it makes sense to me in that order as a story. But some people can do this just by having like statues of the first 5 presidents in their house and remembering, like, okay, like I'm not a visual person. It doesn't work for me at all. So some people remember stories and some people remember landmarks. And the best way to do it is to have a story about your landmark. And that is that kind of myth making and storytelling when you're out on the boat board is exactly how people remembered and figured out how to navigate. And like, my uncle would have all these stories. And I can remember exactly where I was on the bay when he told them. And it really does work. It's how the brain's wired. So founders, the original colonists and discoverers, may have assumed great prestige and importance in Lapita society, providing a powerful incentive for bold voyaging into the unknown. And this is practically, the same thing as we have today with not founders of actual colonies. We have a lot less of those these days, but founders of companies in our society have great prestige and importance. And there's a lot of incentive, at least in my part of Twitter, for people to go start their own business and be the unicorn and make it and be a powerful founder. And like our society, we certainly consider, government officials and civic leaders, we consider them powerful. They have big respect, but they're not rock stars. Like, look at our superheroes. Our superheroes are guys like Tony Stark, who is he inherited his company, but he's a great inventor and he did like amazing things, right? Like when you look at our heroes that are not just like weird outliers, but a lot of our heroes are scientists, they're inventors, they're company founders, they are scrappy young kids who, fight for freedom and justice. And that kind of importance in storytelling, it speaks to the nature of what kids care about and what they grow up to care about and what they want to do when they grow up. There's this really great podcast called The Founders Podcast by David Tenra that I enjoy. And it's for adults, but I even let my kid listen to it, and he finds it pretty engaging. And it just looks at different company founders and their biographies and talks about lessons to learn from them. And you just find that affects the society. All right, so next. If near-ocean societies are any guide, factionalism, ever-shifting alliances, and sudden raids were part of island life, as were cherished relationships between individuals living at considerable distance from another who might meet face-to-face only once or twice in their lifetimes. Such contacts, often endowed with powerful spiritual meaning, are frequently enforced by the exchange of valued objects, formed the umbrella for much wider trading. And I find this really touching because I have quite a lot of internet friends. I have colleagues I only see twice a year. We talk all the time in Slack, but I only see them twice a year. And I have friends that I talk to in Discord that I've been friends with for years, that I vacation with once or twice a year. But we send each other gifts in the mail. I have this wonderful calendar that a friend of mine sent. And little presents, just little gifts. And it really does. It really does make me happy to know that this isn't a particularly new phenomenon. Like, humans have been having long distance relationships and very valued long distance friendships for a very long time. And you find this also in ancient Syria, in Mesopotamia, where these kings would consider themselves a brotherhood. They would send each other gifts, they would marry each other's daughters, but they never met. And you can imagine that the near-oceanian societies had a very similar phenomenon where they considered themselves to be a real and genuine society, even though they almost never saw each other. And it's a fascinating thing about human nature that I don't think we talk about enough in the internet age, where so many relationships are remote and intermittent and distant. And I think I'm going to write an article about that if I get time, about how we are fully capable as an evolved species. Like, we have indeed evolved to have these long distance valuable relationships. And that's quite meaningful to me, because you find a lot of people talking about how Instagram is terrible and Twitter is terrible and social media is terrible for kids and it's not real relationships and it's killing our in-person stuff. And I think it's in a lot of ways true that, certainly you need to have offline things, go out and touch grass, get some sunshine. But it's meaningful to know that a lot of ancient societies, even like pre-writing societies, had these distant relationships. So the Kula is an interwoven fabric of relationships that encompasses men living hundreds of miles from one another, bound together by direct and indirect ties. Over the generations, a vast intertribal network of ideas, cultural influences, art motifs, songs, and alliances travels down the Kula routes. Thousands of men scattered over hundreds of miles enjoy these relationships. So they're very similar to the previous highlight, but more, I think, analogous to the nomadic herders in the Eurasian plains, where they're all bound together by all these ties, and they don't necessarily get together to meet for a big party, but they know each other and they know of each other, and it really does become culture. So, long distance voyaging along familiar routes lay at the core of this empire, combined with strategic marriages that cemented ties over hundreds of miles. Prestigious goods such as bats, feathers, sandalwood, bark cloths, canoes, and pottery flowed into the Tonga Tapu, the pinnacle of what became a highly stratified, quite stable society. Tongan royal power depended on a seamless knowledge of surrounding waters that blurred the distinctions between land and sea. So, should have mentioned this in my recent article about diplomatic marriages, um, but it is certainly true that strategic marriages help bind a society together. And also that, if you are the kind of person for whom the land is just as important as the sea, because you live on land from your day to day. You do a little bit of agriculture, maybe. It's stable. You're a little bit more protected from the wind and the water. But the sea becomes just as important to you, and its contours in the same way that the shape of a hill. You would know where the ledge is in the Chesapeake Bay, and where the fish congregate, and where the island starts to become a navigational hazard. So all of those things are fundamental to these societies in a way that I find important for being able to mentally model other societies, other ways of thinking. So I have done my 30 minutes. I'm going to hop down, have some lunch, and then get back to work. I hope you all enjoyed learning something about the ancient mariners, and have a wonderful Thursday.